With a weary sigh, Calvin Iburn looked up from his novel at the oh-so-stereotypical clock on the waiting room wall. As much as the 32-year-old banker loved reading, he simply abhorred the environment that he was in. And to further press his temper, the way in which the waiting room seats were filled to capacity caused his mind to liken himself to a sardine. A sardine among whales, more like, he noted internally, as the occupants of the seat on the right and left allowed their arms to slide back over into his. Not even that annoyed him more than the man that was seated across from him. The slouch that was seated across from him was definitely in his 40s. Yet he continued to persist in taking photos with his phone's camera and wildly spin it around without the regard of other patients who were awaiting their trip to the doctor. Calvin wagered that the man was playing Postman Flow, a new augmented reality game exclusive to phones which utilized map data from satellites, the random distribution of virtual stamps, and the phone's built-in camera to collect said stamps. The game boasted an impressive catalog of stamps which were assigned types. When 10 of the same type were collected, a wall of text which gave some history about the United States Postal Service would pop up. It was a smashing success. Flash after flash assaulted Iburn's eyes as the moron took photo upon photo. Eventually, his thoughts became a cascade of hatred toward the man. Quit it before I take that phone and drive it through your goddamn skull. He refrained from opening his mouth and letting the entire waiting room in on his thought. However, as it turned out, he needn't bother. Shortly after his angry thought materialized, the idiot's hands spiked his phone through his head with logic-defying force. Enough to cleave it in twain and send the somehow intact phone flying into the nearest wall. Everything about the situation was stunning. From the torrent of blood gushing from where the top half of the idiot's skull should have been, to the mobile phone that had somehow performed such a feat and then managed to become embedded in the waiting room wall. Yet none were more shocked than Calvin, who was privy to knowing that something he had privately thought occurred. The boring waiting room turned into an echo of chamber of screams. Many pushed and shoved in a bid to make it out of the building, their ailments suddenly not affecting them. Others remained seated, staring in terror, shock, or some combination of the two, at the idiot man whose skull had become separated. The top half, which was cut off at the eyes, lay on the floor among a sticky red puddle of blood and chunks of head matter, from jagged white skull fragments to stringy globs of brain that stuck to the floor as they owned it. Calvin couldn't help but stare at the lower half of the man's skull, which was still attached to its body. The former phone wielder's bottom bit of skull was slumped over, and, thanks to the law of physics, the inside content was able to steadily pour out onto his lap and the floor, whichever gravity itself deemed more necessary. Of more interest to Calvin was the fact that the corpse's tongue momentarily spasmed. He fought back vomit as he watched the tongue of the deceased stroke the blood and brain matter that coated its shirt. What a truly unfortunate position and grotesque scene made worse. After the chaos at the building's doors ceased, Calvin made a hasty retreat from the carnage, advancing to his car in the parking lot on very shaky legs. He locked his car doors, leaned back into the cool, leathery driver's seat, and took a moment to rebuild composure. Jesus, what the hell was that? No sooner had those thoughts slipped into his mind when 5 police cars pull up in front of the hospital and park behind each other in single file with sirens blaring. the men in blue poured out of their cars and hesitantly into the building. Some with guns drawn, and others with a hand on their holster, unsure of whether or not to draw their gun. And in a hospital, no less. Good luck figuring that mess out. Speaking of messes, is the hospital going to close for the day? Whatever. I can't deal with going back in there today anyway. I'll just reschedule my appointment. That had to have been a coincidence. I mean, I sure as hell didn't kill him. Maybe that idiot was trying to merge his consciousness with Postman Flo or something. It was definitely a dumbass. With a quick exhale, Calvin buckled his seatbelt and threw his red-colored Mustang into drive. The trip home was a blank in his memory, and his awareness returned when he pulled into his driveway. He had zoned out while driving. Today's unwanted excitement had pretty much put him out of commission. A shower, rescheduling, and sleep were the rest of his actions for the day. As the tired man lay drifting off to sleep, he couldn't help but find it a bit odd that the hospital was already open for scheduling more appointments. They were surprisingly cooperative about him skipping out too, but then nothing was normal about that situation. That sort of thing happening in a waiting room was absurd, and he wasn't even sure what that was. He was just thankful that it wasn't him that it had happened to, and that getting his follow-up done wouldn't be even more of a hassle. The next day rolled around, and the repeat patient went about his business per usual, up until it was time for his appointment, at which point he reluctantly hopped into his car and returned to the hospital. The waiting room expertly hid the event that had occurred yesterday. Not a single sign of it existed, except for the indention in the wall from wherein the cell phone had been retrieved from. Thankfully for Calvin, the waiting room wasn't brimming to capacity as usual, and not only was the check-in process quick, but so was his wait. Approximately 10 minutes after seating himself, a pretty, petite, red-headed nurse swung open one of the 2 double doors that connected the waiting room to the consulting rooms and called for Calvin, with a hint of excitement in her voice. Calvin couldn't help crack a smile when he saw his friend and favorite nurse, Gwen. The two had gotten to know each other quite well over the frequent visits that Calvin had to endure. The silver lining.
"Hello, nurse."
A flurry of laughs escaped from Gwen's throat and cut off with a rather embarrassing snort, which caused her to close the double doors and quickly usher him along the hallway. "Hi, Cal. It always cracks me up hearing you quote cartoons. You're imitating the one with the 3 dog-like characters or whatever they are, right?"
"Yeah, and hey, they were originally going to be ducks. That would have been so boring. Although, I suppose I would have been too young to think that when I watched."
"You're as knowledgeable about them cartoons as ever."
"I know. You can refer to me as the wise one."
"Very well. In which of these rooms are you supposed to see the Dr. Pendrake, wise one?" Gwen said, sweeping her open palm toward the nearest 3 rooms, with the teasing sarcasm in her voice ever apparent.
The one with the open door?"
The nurse's eyes narrowed in challenge. "You win this round, but I'll have you know that was just a practice round. The real question is..." She cleared her throat and let a dramatic pause trail behind her half-finished sentence as she followed Calvin into the consultation room and shut the door behind them. "Are you free Friday?" Although in his 30s and fairly reserved, Calvin could not help but feel his face flush. Was Gwen messing with him? There was certainly a good chance of that, and there was also an equal chance that he was reading too much into her question. But there was also the possibility of...
"Yeah, for a date?"
Gwen swept aside a few locks of her velvet-colored hair and inched her face a bit more closely than was professional to her patient. Her blues met his hazels with a look of absolute resolve behind them. She nearly sung her response. Yep, a date. A few seconds of silence passed, but those seconds felt like an eternity. After using those few precious seconds to compose his thoughts, so as to not blurt out something stupid, he replied,
"Yes, absolutely."
"Good choice. You certainly live up to your title, O wise one." She extended her finger and tapped him on the bridge of his nose to punctuate her remark. Calvin's face took on a shade that rivaled Gwen's hair. After a slight pause in the conversation, he sat down on the edge of the bed and carried on.
"I'm guessing that checking my vitals is going to be a waste of time now, seeing as you've got me all worked up."
A smirk darted across Gwen's face. "Nope, I still have to do it. You're going to be stuck with me for a little bit longer, so lucky." All the routine things that Calvin had been through hundreds of times, such as blood pressure check, were done. However, it all felt very different to him this time. It felt personal. A pretty natural response for one who was being touched by someone that they had attraction to. His eyes wandered across her frame. From velvety hair to black sneaker-encased toe. Despite his attempt at being subtle, her sky-colored irises caught glimpses of his trailing eyes. She kept silent. It couldn't help but smile joyously over Calvin's obvious physical attraction to her. After what seemed like too short of a time, the velcroed cuff was removed from the patient's arm and placed back onto the rack. Picking up on Gwen's hesitation to speak, Cal spoke.
"It's high, isn't it?"
"Well, that's natural considering the circumstances."
"What is it?"
he asked, not really caring, but just wanting to be with her a moment longer. "It's 511-2379.
"That's not right." "Oh."
The beautiful smiling nurse gave a wink and then strode out the door, only pausing to say, "Dr. Pendrake will be with you momentarily. See you soon, Cal." 5 to 10 minutes came to pass. It's hard to know exactly when because consultation rooms never have clocks in them, do they? Until a lean, wrinkly, gray-haired woman with a reserve of energy equal to that of a child entered. Hello, Mr. Iburn. How are you faring?"
"Great."
"Oh, so you'd say that your stomach pain is gone?"
"Not gone, but it is certainly at its lowest since the car accident."
Good. Lift your shirt for me, please." Calvin exposed his stomach, revealing a maze of scarred tissue. An ice-covered road had been unfavorable. His car had slid and smashed into a railing of a bridge, crumpling itself like a tin can, and sending shredded metal from the driver's door into his stomach and part of his small intestine. The miracles of science, medicine, luck, and perhaps even divine intervention were responsible for his present state of being able to recover and walk around unimpeded. Boy, those scars remind me of a particular gnarly painting Arthur made for his art class every time I see them.
"Arthur? Is that your grandson? What was the painting of?"
"Arthur is my 42-year-old son." The old lady paused with a smile. "The painting was made up of a group of black snakes going every which way. I remember the painting so well because the art teacher was concerned over the painting and said it suggested that there were issues with Arthur's home life. Of course, I gave them a piece of my mind and told him to stop trying to cause issues where there weren't any. Anyhow, your scars looked as healed as they'll get."
"That's a shame, but thanks."
"You might stop by for one last checkup in a month or two, but I don't think it's really necessary." Cal left his appointment, and began to prepare for his date with Gwen.